Garden Line, we'll learn how to prepare garden produce before pressure canning.
And just go around the jar to remove any air bubbles.
Funding for Garden Line is provided in part by your membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And by Swiftel Communications.
Hello and welcome to Garden Line. I'm Stephen Monk. Tonight in our show, we will get outside of the studio here and out into the kitchen. You'll hear from an extension expert who will demonstrate how to properly use a pressure canner to safely preserve your garden harvest. And as always, our panel of lawn and garden experts are here to answer your questions with the most up-to-date information about gardening, lawn care, insects, trees, and a host of other lawn and garden related concerns. So get ready to call in. The phone number for you to call is 1-866-595-SDSU. Again, that is 1-866-595-7378. Joining me in the studio to answer your questions is John Keykafer, Brookings County Extension Educator, David Graper, Extension Horticulturalist, Mike Meckning, he's our Extension Weed Specialist, and John Ball, Extension Forestry Specialist. Helping to answer the phones tonight are the folks from the Brookings Area Master Gardeners. And remember, when you call in with your questions, please provide the phone volunteers with as much information as possible about your garden problem. Be ready to provide a description of the problem, when the problem first appeared, whether it's affecting any other surrounding plants, and moisture or and soil conditions that exist. But first off, we're going to go around the table to hear from our panel on what is currently happening. So, starting with you, John Keykafer, what's out there in the insect world?
We're at that time of year when some of those common garden pests have taken off, and we've got a lot of them moving out in the gardens. And so I went out earlier today and took a few photos of some of these things that we're seeing. And one of our common ones that we're seeing on almost all of our potato plants right now is the Colorado potato beetle. These are the striped potato beetles that people worry about getting onto their potatoes. And one of the interesting things about these beetles is that they are not strictly limited to potatoes. People assume they are, but they'll switch on to other things as well. So I found some today on tomatoes. They get onto eggplants. They'll get onto closely related plants, any of those in that same family, that solanaceous type plant. They can feed on that and do quite well on it. And this is a picture here. We've got an adult and a larva on a leaf here. They're a little bit different than some of our other pests as well, because these things are feeding on the same food source as both larvae and as adults. A lot of times we'll see a differentiation there. We'll have larvae feeding on one food source and adults on a separate one, so they aren't competing. In this case, they'll feed on the same one. They'll feed side by side, and they'll share that. In some ways it makes them a little easier to control because you can control either life stage that way, and in some ways it's a little more challenging because you can't catch them at a more susceptible time necessarily. This is a picture mentioned. This is actually on a tomato flower. They're not fussy about what part of the plant they eat, and this is actually a Colorado potato beetle larva eating a tomato flower. So they'll switch over quite well on there. For control on these guys, really what we're thinking most is going to be trying to time things and remove that residue, get rid of that source of young bugs coming in out there, those young potato beetles, and trying to control them that way. Got another insect here as well. This is our squash vine borer, and just like the potato beetles, it's not limited to squash. And so a lot of times people will think that because it's a squash vine borer, you only find these things on squash. They like all of the members of that family equally as well. They go to zucchini and squash and pumpkins and all of those sorts of plants and do quite well on all of them. And You'll actually find these things flying around laying eggs right now. They look like wasps when they're flying, and so they confuse a lot of people that way. They are actually moths, and the larvae bore through the stalks of those plants. And so usually when people find the damage is when the stalks start to wilt and wither away, and they break off and they discover that they've got kind of a decent-sized white caterpillar tunneling through that stalk, and by that point it's a little late to control them. So if you are thinking of control of them at this time of year, you're going to want to look at putting some sort of insecticide around the base of that plant. They like to oviposit or lay their eggs right down near the soil surface, right on those vines as they're growing out of the ground.
Okay, a couple little pests that commonly are in the garden spots.
And out and active right now.
Okay, thank you, John. Dave, what do you have for us tonight?
Well, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the early tomato diseases that we have out there. We've had certainly the wet conditions that are ideal for fungal and bacterial diseases to occur, and especially on tomatoes, which are one of our favorite crops in the vegetable garden, but also very prone to quite a few different diseases and insect problems as well. But I'm going to focus on two mainly tonight. The first one is septoria leaf spot. This is a very common disease and probably the most common disease that we get questions about on tomatoes here on Garden Line and in the county extension offices and so forth. It's caused by a fungus, and you'll start out seeing little dark dots with a little yellowish halo around each one of the little spots. Usually starts on the lowest leaves first, and I think we even have an email question tonight about some spots showing up on tomatoes. So if you see those little tiny spots that turn dark later and then the leaves start turning yellow, that's probably septoria leaf spot. The next image has a little bit bigger picture of, or a closer picture of the spots. You can see they're pretty small, little necrotic spots, and then later that whole leaf will turn yellow. The best control strategies for these are, for this and for the other disease that I'll talk about, is start early with some mulching to help reduce some of that water splashing up from the base down there, and that's going to help. Leon talked a little bit about using some mulch last week. The next disease is the other most common disease that we see, and that's late blight. And even though it's one that usually shows up fairly early in the season, this is late blight. This is a fungal disease also, and this has a very different look to it. You'll notice that the whole leaf or sections of the leaf will start turning yellow. The next image shows a little bit, another shot of the symptoms right on a leaf. You can see where it's going to take out the whole section of the leaf, and this is going to go across the veins in the leaf. And you can also see on the next image where it can take out the whole tip of the leaf, and the last image shows some damage showing up on the stems of the tomato as well. So you can get a lot of damage with this disease, and it can spread very, very rapidly, especially when you have warm, moist conditions like we've been having with the rainfall and so forth. And again, some simple things that we can do: crop rotation, don't put your tomatoes back in the same spot each year. Look for resistant varieties. Mulch after the plants have been established. That's going to help reduce some of the spread of that splashing water and so forth. And then we can look at some fungicide options. The most common one is to look for a fungicide that contains chlorothalonil. That's going to be the active ingredient. So look at your local hardware store or garden center. You'll see some garden disease control chemicals out there. Look for that chlorothalonil to be on the label. And there's also a pretty good extension publication out there that has a whole host of control strategies and disease descriptions and so forth for vegetable crops that was put together a few years ago. I think if you go and check out the Garden Line website, you'll see a link for that publication up there, but that'll give you some more information for some of the other diseases on vegetables.
Now, you mentioned using mulch as far as the water splashing up on the lower parts of the plant. It's not actually the water, but the water splashing soil, contaminated soil up is what we're concerned about. Is that?
Yep.
Okay.
Water hits the soil, and if there's leftover spores from last year, that splashes up into the plant and spreads the disease. So you've hit on another area that we can help control it, and that's to use a drip irrigation system instead of a sprinkler overhead type system, and that's going to reduce the chances also. But when we have these wind-blown rain events like we've been having, it's going to spread pretty easily.
Okay. And we certainly have had the moisture. So.
We have.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Mike.
Yes.
I haven't seen too many weeds out there
No,
this year.
it's been great.
You're doing a good job.
Yeah, speaking of the rain, it also brings in the diseases and the bugs and the weeds as well. And now we're just getting pummeled with all these weeds coming up with all this moisture and warm conditions. Two weeds I want to talk about tonight. One, I've been getting questions on this yellow wood sorrel, and the other one is that nasty Canada thistle to be looking for. So a couple weeds I want to talk about. But first, yellow wood sorrel. Been getting a bunch of questions on this lately in lawns. A tough one to kill because it's not really susceptible to a lot of our herbicides, but it's not one that you need to get too worried about either. I understand it can be a perennial, so it can survive for a couple of years or so, but it's usually not too invasive. You'll usually see it in thinner parts of the lawns, landscape areas, that sort of thing. So just going out hand pulling or thickening up that lawn, a little fertilizer, moisture, things like that, maybe interseeding this fall. Thickening up that lawn is probably going to be the best long-term solution for yellow wood sorrel. Herbicides, there is a herbicide, if you really look, Weed Be Gone for clover, chickweed, and oxalis. That's actually the name of it. Weed Be Gone for clover, chickweed, and oxalis. Contains triclopyr, and that one won't volatilize like 2,4-D, so that's a little bit safer under warm conditions than your standard lawn herbicides. But like I say, this one, not a big problem. Probably the best thing out there, just go pick them by hand. You don't have to pick them all in one day, and thicken up that turf. That'll get rid of the yellow wood sorrel. So maybe a little bit of a long-term solution on that one. The other species, another tough one, another real tough perennial is Canada thistle. Just want to mention right now, this one's starting to flower, and a lot of times people ask, well, gee, when this one starts to flower, how long before it starts producing seed? Usually in about 10 days, your Canada thistle will start producing seed after it begins flowering. And so I don't have a picture of Canada thistle, but you all know what Canada thistle looks like, so picture is not needed. One of the things I want to mention, though, it seems like Canada thistle is a lost cause in South Dakota, right? It's everywhere. But we've actually driven Canada thistle populations down in the last 10 years. We've driven Canada thistle populations down by about 100 to 200,000 acres in South Dakota over the last 10 years. So the trend is declining. So if we keep at it, we can beat Canada thistle. So I'd encourage everybody now, before it starts fuzzing out, to go out there and get that Canada thistle. Every patch counts to beat that one back. So get the Canada thistle before it starts fuzzing out, which will be in about a week or so.
All right. Wood sorrel, I know as kids we'd always bite on the leaves of those. It has kind of a bitter, unique flavor to it.
Yeah, that's right. It's called oxalis because it contains oxalic acid, which gives it kind of a tart taste. So yeah, people might put it in salads and things like that, and it can be somewhat edible. The oxalic crystals can cause kidney stones if you eat too much, so everything in moderation, but it does have a real tart taste.
Well, as far as driving Canada thistle, I think they drove a couple of those spots around my place, so
okay.
I'll have to address them there.
Controlling them,
yep.
That sort of thing. So. Yeah. It's a tough weed, but boy, we're making progress on it.
Okay. Thank you, Michael.
Yep.
John, what do you have for us on the tree side of things?
Well, in fact, it showed up here just a moment ago, and that is flooding. That's obviously somewhat localized, but I will say that no matter where you live in the state, we're having saturated soil conditions. I mean, I was out trying to put fence posts in, and you start hitting water at a foot if you leave it for a few minutes. And so those saturated soil conditions are contributing to a lot of tree problems already, and problems we're going to see next year and the year after. But the other one is the actual flooding, where we have trees with water covering the trunks. And there's no worse time for a tree to be standing in water than now. And we're probably going to see damage to these trees showing up next year, the following year. I'm willing to bet I take a garden line question in 2014 saying, my tree's dying. Well, it was standing in water for 3 months. Well, that'll do it. To start helping people in the areas that are most heavily impacted by flooding, the Pierre area and then the Dakota Dunes, tomorrow night in Pierre we're going to be having a discussion from 7 to 8 o'clock at the Capital University Center to talk about flooding and talk about how that affects trees, what trees are most affected, what are least, and also what should you be doing now and what should you be doing once these floodwaters recede, because there's a number of things, activities that people can engage in once the floodwaters go. I realize you're going to have a lot of other things on their plate, I mean the home alone, but nevertheless there's going to be a couple things that if they get right to it after these floodwaters retreat, they may be able to save the trees depending on the species. So tomorrow night in Pierre, and then coming up, and we'll announce it here on Garden Line, will be another session in Dakota Dunes.
Okay, very good. Now, would shrubs fall into that category very similarly, or do they tolerate the moisture any better.
No, they're kind of a lost cause. If you're looking down through the water at the plant, it's gone. So for a lot of shrubs, the evergreen shrubs, they're dead. Many of our deciduous shrubs, some will make it, some won't. Those I'm going to tell people just wait and see. But you know, you can plant another shrub and get it back in 3 years. It's the trees that I'm really worried about. But yeah, put it this way: if it's underneath the water levels right now, unless it's got a little straw and getting oxygen to it, it's more than likely going to be gone.
Okay, thanks, John. All right, gentlemen, time for our questions that have come in. So, Dave, this one comes from Rural Winter. Peonies, they did well. They're done blooming. Should she cut it off? Flowers or leaves?
Well, the easiest thing to do is just cut off the remaining, probably developing seed head that you're going to see there, a little fruit developing on the end of that stem. Just cut that back to where the first leaf is. That's going to improve the appearance of the plant a little bit. As far as is it going to really detract from the plant's growth if you don't do that, if it's a big healthy peony that's been there for a long time, except if it's underwater, it probably isn't going to make any difference, but it does improve the appearance by cutting those off.
Okay. John, from Rapid City, an insect question here. Small flea beetles, they're a terrible problem. They've tried Sevin and soaps. That really seems to have no effect on them. Wondering if they will go away with the heat, or is there another way to deal with them? Tomatoes, peppers, potatoes are the plants being affected. Are they in the soil, or is there any kind of pre-treatment that they could use?
Right. Well, they answered a lot of the questions that I would have had, so that's a good start on this. There are a number of species of these small flea beetles that get into these crops. We tend to think of Colorado potato beetle, the one I already talked about, as being the main beetle pest of potatoes and tomatoes and eggplants and those sorts of things. And they're one of several. These little flea beetles do just as much damage, and in some cases more damage, than the large Colorado potato beetles, and they're in the same family. So they look different, they're much smaller, but they are in the same family. With that in mind, you're going to end up treating them kind of similarly, honestly. The same sorts of chemicals that you would use against Colorado potato beetle will work against those flea beetles. Same thing here, they're going to develop in the soil as larvae. They feed on the potato roots as larvae and then overwinter in that soil and emerge from that and feed on those leaves the next season. So really you're going to want to try to move those potatoes to a different area if possible. Tillage will help cut down on those somewhat, and then timing that spray application to try to get rid of as many as possible. And we're at a good time now. If you're seeing large numbers of them, go ahead and try putting a chemical on there. Sevin's not a bad choice. We've had some resistance questions with Colorado potato beetle, and in some cases that's certainly the case. In some cases I think maybe the resistance is a result more of people not timing it quite right, or it doesn't go on quite right, or gets washed off right away. And it's easier to blame it on a resistance problem than to think that maybe it was something that needed another application on it.
The damage it caused, how do they actually do that? Is it chewing or?
Right, yeah, the beetles, like most of these beetles, chew holes through the leaves, and obviously with the Colorado potato beetles, they take some big notches out of those leaves. With these smaller flea beetles, they take little pinholes out of there. It looks like a shot holing pattern on there. And they avoid the veins of the leaves. They feed on that center part. So you'll see some of that. They also spread some diseases, and so you'll see at times even some yellowing and things like that of the potatoes because of them.
Okay, thank you, John. Mike from Freeman, need to spray the lawn for crabgrasses. MSO also is what they've sprayed on the lawn. So,
okay.
Any thoughts on that for post-emergence?
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I'm not sure what the MSO. The MSO is just an adjuvant, so not really or maybe MSA or MSM. Anyway, the spray that you're going to look at for post-emergence crabgrass control is quinclorac. That's the chemical quinclorac, and you can find that in there's Weed Be Gone. It'll say plus crabgrass. There's Bayer Advanced, weed control. It'll say plus crabgrass on it. But quinclorac is the chemistry that you're going to look for. And those are herbicides you can spray post-emergence on crabgrass to control that emerged crabgrass. And you want to control it before it heads out. So now you're seeing those little crabgrass plants out there. They're not heading out yet, so now might be a good time. The problem is these herbicides are also mixed with 2,4-D and dicamba, and those herbicides can volatilize very easily, and that vapor cloud can travel across your yard into your tomatoes, your potatoes, and your flowers, and that sort of thing. So that's a disadvantage, and it's so unfortunate that that's how they're mixed. You can't buy a quinclorac by itself, only mixed with 2,4-D and dicamba, as far as, you know, your hardware store type chemistries. Professionals can get the single product. So that's a disadvantage. So there are sprays available, but just keep in mind there's going to be potential for vapor drift and that sort of thing. And so, you know, they're somewhat effective. The best thing is going to be to go in there next spring, go with a pre-emergence weed and feed type crabgrass preventer, you know, last week of April, first week of May. That's going to be the best way to control crabgrass post-emergence. But the sprays are one thing. Also keep in mind that you cannot use those grass clippings in your garden because that quinclorac can linger on those grass clippings, and that can get on your potatoes or your tomatoes and cause some injury that way as well. So if you do apply those herbicides, you want to wait maybe, you know, 4 mowings or so, 3-4 mowings before you use those clippings as mulch. So it's a couple disadvantages there. Yeah, Dave, you have some.
Would that quinclorac do anything with shoot, now I just went right foxtails?
Yes, any of your grass species, you know, sandburrs are a big one that people really don't like. That's a grass gets those little burrs on it. Yeah, most of your grass species will probably respond, your annual grass species will respond to the quinclorac.
It's okay for buffalo grass?
I think it is okay for buffalo grass as well, but it contains dicamba, which can be hard on your buffalo grass in midsummer when you get real hot conditions. No dicamba on the buffalo grass. And so it's just really annoying that you can only buy these as a package with broadleaf herbicides. But that's the way it is. It's very potent on crabgrass, but a lot of disadvantages. Okay. So just be careful.
Well, I apologize for the question. I couldn't get through the writing that was on here. Quinclorac, they plan to use that, and MSO, they were wondering if they should add that to that.
Oh no! Only if you buy only if you're using quinclorac by itself, which might be sold as Drive, might be the name brand for that. Then you would have to add a surfactant like MSO.
Okay, but it's very unlikely you get straight.
Yeah, as far as your homeowner, the product that you get at your grocery or at your hardware store, that's going to be pre-mixed with 2,4-D and dicamba.
Okay.
So no MSO in that.
Okay. John, this is plastic, John Ball, plastic covering around the trunk of young trees. People are leaving these on the trees. Is this healthy for the tree? The leaves are sticking out from the top of the plastic tube.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, they're talking about grow tubes. And I wanted to separate that from just the white plastic wrap that people put around their trunks of the trees. And the plastic wrap that's tight on the trunks of the trees, that should have been off 2 months ago. 3 months ago would have been better. That's winter protection only, and that's for small critters for the most part, some sun-scald. But the tree tubes are a little bit wider, and actually those are designed for the tree to grow inside them that first growing season, and you can get tremendous growth. I mean, you'll get 3-4 feet of growth on them the first year, and little leaves will stick out of the top, and everybody's happy. So, no, you don't take those off yet. Leave them. But they were developed in Europe, and Europe has a different climate than South Dakota. Well, at least it used to. I mean, it's wet here now, too. But in the good old days when it was dry. But one of the problems you have is that sometimes those tubes keep them a little warm, and plants don't start hardening off in time for winter. So what I really recommend with those grow tubes is in the fall of the year, just lift them up about an inch or so, put a little brick or something underneath them so you get airflow through them. That'll help the plant shut down. But believe it or not, we've had winter injury on cottonwoods in those tubes because they don't harden off in time. It's kind of like a little greenhouse. But for the first year or two, they're a great way to push a seedling up. I mean, it's fast growth. If Casey was here, he could talk about the birds you catch too. So you get a bird in there, and if a mouse drops in, it's in mouse heaven. But otherwise, they're great. So no, don't take those off yet.
Okay. Dave, tomatoes, once again, kind of coming back to what you talked about earlier from Yankton. He has blight in his tomatoes. He did put aluminum foil around the base of the tomatoes, but he's wondering if the disease is in the stalk because he keeps peeling off the yellow leaves, but they keep showing up on the plant. And if we feel it is in the plant, should he replant?
Well, I don't know that septoria leaf spot is going to get onto the stems of tomato. I'm not sure about that. Late blight certainly does get on the stems. But if you're seeing the small little dots and the leaves turning yellow, sometimes it's hard to really pick off the leaves after they've already been infected because you don't see the symptoms right away. So even though you're picking off the yellow leaves, there's probably green appearing leaves that are already infected, so that's probably why you aren't able to keep up with picking off those leaves. As far as replanting, yeah, you could still do that, but you're going to have to try to find some good-sized tomato plants to probably still get you some ripe tomatoes by the end of the season. And you're going to want to plant them in a different location than where you are now. Even though with the aluminum mulch around there, I think you're going to want to probably try a different location.
Okay. John Ball from Del Rapids. Buffalo berries, will they grow in my area? If so, is there a nursery in South Dakota that carries them?
Well, you know what? Conservation districts carry them. And so you could get those in the spring bare root. And that's probably the best way to plant them. So I just go down to your conservation district next spring and say, hey, I want to get some of those buffalo berries. But here's the bad news. Buffalo berry really likes dry climate, not a lot of soil moisture. That's one of those plants that I see that does better West River than East River. Sometimes we end up with some leaf diseases on them because our air is more humid. Having said that, I've also seen some nice plants East River. So, and I think, Dave, you got a few out at McCory Gardens, and those look nice. I've last couple of years I've taken little samples for the shrubs class, and I've never seen any problems on them. So, I'd say try a few, buy them bare root, plant them. Apparently, they must like the fruit. Maybe that's why they're planting them, or they like the silver color. But if you have the fruit once, that's probably enough. All right.
Acquired taste.
A very acquired taste.
Yeah, they're pretty bitter.
Yeah.
And hard to actually harvest. They're so small to peel them off. So
that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Keeps you from trying to eat a lot of them.
All right. From Rapid City, John, they have 10 Russian olive trees, 8 years old, planted all in a row. Same conditions. The one in the middle is dying from the top down. Take your guess.
Yeah, you got that right. Well, it's the poor sibling that's being fought between the other two. I don't know. We see a lot of problems with Russian olive. If you're driving out by Wasto, you'll see a couple of belts out there. They're dead now. They had a twig blight in them, but they also get twig blight. They get verticillium wilt. They get a couple of canker diseases, and if they get wet conditions, they die too. So why that one died, I don't know. There's half a dozen possible reasons that I can think of that are just biological, let alone something related to the planting and that. What I would suggest, though, since it may be one of the canker diseases, and that I would prune it out, or if the whole plant's just about dead, I would cut it out and dispose the materials just in case. I mean, they don't look that great out there, to be frank. The nation's largest Russian olive is in South Dakota. I mean, our claim to fame, isn't that embarrassing? And it's out by the Rapid City Speedway, and it was actually in the Arbor Day calendar a number of years ago. I think it was July. And it's the ugliest tree you've ever seen. But yeah, we have number one, and really, that's as good as they look. So.
Plus, it's an invasive species. It grows really well as you go west and gets a little drier, unfortunately, because it becomes a very big problem out there. Not very invasive in South Dakota because of the disease problems that we have. Yeah. So.
Plus, if there's one blessing to the flood, Russian olive gets taken out real easy by floods. That back in the 90s when we had that flood, a lot of high water table, you can drive by and see a lot of dead Russian olive. But the only good I can think about them, except if you're up in Harding County, yeah, they do make a nice belt, is the wood. The wood's actually pretty nice. You can make gun stocks out of it. And that, so it does have a redeeming value, but you're right, it's invasive and it's from somewhere else, so with that.
All right. David from Brookings, raspberries. The plants were doing well, however, the top leaves on some of the plants are starting to turn a dark green, even black, and then are shriveling up. Just noticed that in the last couple of days. They keep them watered. It's never done this before. They've not been sprayed with anything this year, and have been established several years, and they cut them back every year like they're supposed to. So, any ideas what they may have?
I'm going to share this one with John, actually. I think this might be like a twig borer kind of insect problem that's pretty common on raspberries. If you look down right below where that wilting segment is, you might see some little rings of tissue have been removed. And if you slice that stem open, you're going to find a little larvae inside there.
That would be, I think, probably the most likely culprit in this case.
Yeah.
Though I'll disagree, only because I have the same thing out at my place. You know, I got miles of the stuff. And while there is a little cane borer in there, if what they're talking about is that you see the wilted tips and you grab the plant and pull it and it breaks off right at the base.
Yep.
I've gone through to look and you can't find an insect to it. What I found associated with is one of the cane blights. And what I did, because I had a real problem with it last year, this spring I went out with lime sulfur, sprayed everything just as they were breaking bud. This sounds like a fall-bearing raspberry. And I still have a little of it, but far less than I had last year. So you're right, there is a cane borer, but I just want to let them know they may be looking at a possibility of a disease as well.
And even just wet conditions can
Oh,
affect
yeah.
the raspberries too.
Yeah, raspberries do not like wet feet. But yeah, the question I'd ask is if they find it and it breaks off at the tip, or just below it, it could be one of the cane borers. There's an agralis that does it. But if they pull it and the whole thing breaks off very cleanly right at the base, they may be looking at environmental or disease problem instead, but hopefully not much.
So they can go out and scout and kind of determine themselves.
Yeah, that'd be easy. I mean, it doesn't take much pressure to pull it, and it'll look like it came off cleanly at the base. If you're just getting a few of them, it's not going to be a problem. My guess is they've got a fall-bearing plant because they said they cut everything to the ground.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, it's not too early to start planning for your harvest. And with that in mind, we're going to take you to the Fay Tyler Wade Food Laboratory at South Dakota State University, where Extension Family Consumer Science educator Sandra Napkin has some tips on the basics of canning. We'll begin our lesson with how to get the jars and lids ready to can your vegetables.
Hi, I'm Sandra Namkin, Hamlin County Extension Educator, and I am on campus of SDSU today in the Fay Tyler Wade Foods Lab, and I'm going to be teaching you about doing some pressure canning. Canning can be a successful way of preserving those garden vegetables for later use. Most of the garden vegetables that we're growing are low acid foods which have a pH of 4.6 or higher, so we need to make sure that we use the pressure canner to safely preserve those foods. There is a chance of there being botulinum spores in the foods, and with the pressure canner we can kill them by reaching that temperature of 240 degrees or higher. First of all, you need to use a standard jar, which is a mason jar. It's heavier tempered glass and it's less likely to break in the pressure canner. We also want to check the jars to make sure there are no nicks or cracks on the top rim of that jar. We have our jars hot, and we're going to start adding the vegetables to that jar. Today I'm using carrots, and we need to allow for about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of head space in that jar so that there's room for those foods to expand during that canning process. So that inch is about to the bottom or of the lower rim there. Then we are going to add boiling water to the level of head space. And then you can take a plastic handle or wooden handle and just go around the jar to remove any air bubbles. You don't want to use a metal knife or anything metal because that can weaken the glass and can cause breakage. Sometimes after you've done this, you may even need to add a little bit of water if the water is not covering the tops of the vegetables. Now we're going to wipe the top rim of the jar to make sure that we don't have any food on that top of that jar, because that could prevent getting a good seal. We're going to add a hot lid, and again, some things have changed. They don't recommend boiling that lid anymore, just having it in some hot water, because that could over soften that canning sealant that's there. We're going to add the screw band to the jar, and we are to just finger tighten that screw band. Over tightening of the screw band could cause the lids to buckle. So right now we are ready to add the jar of food to the canner.
Well, we want to thank Sandra for that information on canning, because it'll be just around the corner when these things will be ready to be harvested. So we want to do it properly. So, Dave, we're going to come back to you here now with a question and answer sessions. Flandreau, Iris, wondering if this is the time to trim back the stalks and the leaves.
Well, it's certainly a good time to trim back the flower stalks that were on there. Again, that's going to improve the appearance of the plants. You might reduce some of the seed production that could be there, but again, that's not a big deal. As far as cutting back the foliage, I would suggest that you don't cut back the foliage. Leave that foliage intact. The more leaves you have, the more carbohydrates that plant's going to produce, and the better carbohydrate storage you're going to have for better flowers next year. The only exception to that I believe, is if you're going to be transplanting those iris, and now is a good time to be doing that as well. Then you might want to cut the leaves back about 1/3 or so, just to reduce some of that transpirational loss that you get from those plants when you transplant them. But otherwise, if the leaves are healthy, don't cut them back. If you have iris leaf spot, that could be another reason to cut some of those leaves back, to cut off the damaged sections. But otherwise, leave the foliage there. That's going to be bigger, better iris next year.
Okay, good. Well, as every week we mention that individuals can, and we encourage you to send in questions, either email or even surface mail, and we have some this week as well that we can go over. This one comes from Hot Springs, John Ball. They have a volunteer chokecherry bush on the edge of their garden. This spring after it blossomed, I noticed discoloration, disfigurement on the leaves, and the fruit clusters dried up. Attached are a couple pictures. The bush is 5 feet tall. It gets full sun. There are no fruit trees of the plum species in our yard.
Well, you know, it's a tough one from this picture. I was just kind of thinking for a moment, they ought to do this segment on call. You can send in pictures of yourself and ask the doctors what's wrong with you. But this could be a number of things by looking at that picture. I mean, one of the things that we are seeing is even wet feet on any of your prunus. There's a tremendous amount of problems with saturated soils. Hot Springs may or may not. The spotting on it looks a little bit like our shot hole disease. Those spots start falling out about now. We have a number of fungal diseases that affect the fruit as well. So I'm really sorry that I can't narrow it down in this, but prunus, the genus which this plant's in, cherries, get about every insect and disease problem in the book. I mean, if you say, you know what, I'm just not happy unless I've got problems with my plants, plant chokecherries, and you'll have them. So now I see this is in Hot Springs, and I'm going to be in Hot Springs Monday. So give me the address. I may stop by and try to help them out, because it's hard from the picture, but he certainly wanted to send in a picture, so I want to see if he can get an answer.
We will do that. The next one comes to us from Chamberlain. I discovered these small, just under ½ caterpillars on many leaves of my coneflower that they have. So far, it just seems to be on one plant, but the leaves that the caterpillars are on are dying. They're not eating holes in the leaves, but instead they're eating the green tissue and leave only the netting of the leaf. What is it? Will it spread to the other types of plants, and how do I get rid of it? John Kiefer, any ideas?
Yeah, I think this is actually a butterfly caterpillar, and some people out there might look at it and think that this is a painted lady caterpillar. I don't think it is. I think this is actually a silvery checker spot is the name of the butterfly. It's in the same family as the painted lady. These get onto a number of the composites, coneflowers among the composites, and other plants as well. I guess honestly I don't have a great control method out here for them. If you don't have very many of them, you could simply pick them off and remove them if you wanted to. Otherwise, they are a nice butterfly to have around the garden, and if you want to keep them around, you can certainly leave them alone and let them grow up and turn into butterflies. And if you really do want to look at a chemical control, I mentioned they look something like those painted ladies. They're in the same family. If you find a product that's labeled for use or works well on painted lady caterpillars or thistle caterpillar larvae on sunflowers, that same product will work well in this setting.
Okay. The next one comes to us from Watertown, and this one says, "Help! This is my ornamental crabapple tree, and this happened in the last month. I planted the tree 2 years ago. They cut off some small branches that the wind had broken, but the branches were up high, not really near this. This is about 3 feet up the tree on the north side. The other bark breakage is on the south side, and it looks like it just started to tear off. It's about 2.5 feet up the trunk. I have squirrels and rabbits running around, but I don't think they did that on the tree. Do I need to do anything to repair it? Years ago, we used to put on some kind of black tree paint, and they want to know if that still is a practice, which it may be, but it may be, is a question, a recommended practice. I don't want to lose this tree. It replaces a tree that the wind blew down 4 years ago." John Ball, your insight.
You're going to lose the tree. No. No, but it's hard to tell what caused that. It'd have to be a rather big bunny, and squirrels usually are doing this very early in the spring, not within the last month. It may be related to a canker problem too. But she's correct, we don't recommend painting anymore. What I would suggest is if there's any torn bark around this, and I wasn't quite sure if I did see that, I would clean that off with a knife. And if there is torn bark, that would indicate that you may have had squirrels on there instead. But once you do that, leave it. There is no product you can place on that will, quote, heal it or reduce the chance of decay. The other last bit of information I'd give you is that we're most concerned how much it goes around the trunk, not how far it goes up and down. So our general rule is if it goes less than 1/3 the way around the trunk, the tree can usually recover from that, assuming it's not injured again. In this case, it looked like less than 1/3, so you're probably best just clean up any torn bark if there is any loose bark with a sharp knife. Don't trace it any more than that. Don't paint it, and keep your fingers crossed.
Okay. You mentioned like a knife, like a box cutter. Would that, something in that order is what you're suggesting?
Yeah, you could do it, but I mean, if you keep your pocket knife sharp, you can do that too.
Okay.
It's pretty easy to cut.
Well, that's the key, to keep it sharp.
Yeah, keep it sharp. Yeah, don't carry dull knives.
Okay. This one question comes to us from Mitchell, and it deals with tomatoes. The new growth on my tomato plants have turned yellow, but the newest growth on the plant is doing this. I first noticed this last week. After the first really hot day of the summer. It seems to be affecting other plants. It seems to be affecting other plants in the garden as well. Peas, beans, even lamb's quarters. Is this a disease or perhaps moisture problem? My first thought was a drift from Roundup, as there was a field of soybeans 150 feet away whose weeds started to die about the same time as these started to turn color. The soils are heavy. The water has been plentiful. However, the water table is a good 3 to 4 feet below the surface. Any thoughts or insight on these graphics?
Well, yeah, and the fact that it's on several different species at the same time is one indication that it may not be a disease or a species-specific type insect or something like that. So, yeah, what we're looking at here, unfortunately, could be a little bit of exposure to that Roundup or that glyphosate herbicide that was applied in the field. Glyphosate does cause a yellowing, and we saw the blotching on those tomato leaves, which is consistent with what we might see from plants that have been exposed to glyphosate. Here we see some general yellowing. Plants just look sickly. We see the upper leaves where the herbicide is concentrated the most. That's where their growth is most rapid, and so that's where we see the most injury. So, yeah, it looks like a little bit of glyphosate exposure, possibly. And so, it looks fairly minor on a lot of these. They may grow out of it. But unfortunately, our standard recommendation when we do get some herbicide drift on our plants is generally we should not eat the produce from those plants. And so that may be a downside. But I guess keep an eye on it. And there are ways of we can get the vegetation tested. There's a lab at SDSU, Olson Labs, that will test residues, but that's an expensive test. It may cost about $100, and so that's kind of spendy. So I guess kind of wait and see. Hopefully they'll grow out of it, and you'll have a long time span between the produce, but generally if your produce is being developed here within the next couple of weeks, we probably don't want to eat those.
Okay. The next sample that came in to us is an actual sample that came in a little bottle, and they would like to know what these worms or maggots are. They found them in the house, and I found a couple of them in a bag that was in the house. Any idea what we might have there, John?
Well, unfortunately, this is one of those. I like getting the real samples, but when these things came through, and it's going to be too small to even show on here, but it was sent in a pill bottle. The specimen itself pretty well disintegrated in transit, and so you got a little fragment to work with there, and that's about all that's left of it, or a few little pieces of it. So I have a couple guesses on it, and that's about all it is. Now, before we get into that, if you are sending a sample, what I'd really recommend doing on these is, pill bottle works great, but if you put some cotton balls in there, freeze it and then put some cotton balls in there and mail it that way, the cotton balls will help pad them, and hopefully they won't break up in there quite as much. And
when you say freeze it, you're talking about the insect first?
About the insect,
and then put
right.
the cotton balls in?
Right.
Okay.
Yep. And freezing just kills the insect. And you could actually put the cotton balls in first. They freeze just fine too. So that won't be any problem. But freezing kills them, keeps them dry, and they are nice specimens to work with that way. Sometimes if you soak them in soapy water or something like that, they get kind of dark and greasy. But as far as what it is, there are two fairly logical guesses on this based on the little segments that are left. I suspect really what these are millipedes. These are the ones that I've answered a couple times on the show this year. Some people call them wire worms, and they're not worms, and they're not wire worms either. They're not. Wire worms are larvae of a different insect. Millipedes are not insects at all. They're more closely related to arachnids than they are to insects, but they've got 2 pairs of legs per body segment, and they crawl around and feed on a number of decaying things, and they're common in these wet years like this year, and they will come into a house. The other possibility that it could be, and I don't really think it is, but there's a chance on this as well, would be dermestid larvae, carpet beetle or larder beetle larvae, and they get into homes and feed on a number of different things in there, and can survive on just about nothing and do quite well. So either one of those is a possibility. Not larvae of the Asian lady beetles. Those things look quite a bit different than these. And if they're millipedes, not much that you need to do other than sweep them up. If you have the dermestid larvae, you're probably going to want to do some thorough cleaning and try to prevent access to whatever it is they're feeding on.
Okay. Dave, this one comes back to us from Sioux Falls. How to harvest rhubarb. All my life I put the hand to the ground and pulled the stalk out. But now someone has told them that they should use a sharp knife and cut it even with the ground. Do you have a preferred method or recommendation for this?
I do the old-fashioned tug method myself. I think pulling it out and getting the base of that petiole removed from the crown of the plant is probably the best thing to do. If you cut it off, you're going to leave that little stub of a petiole there behind that stalk, and that could decay and cause some problems potentially. But I think the easiest thing is just pull it out and make your rhubarb pie or cake or whatever and have at it.
How long should you harvest rhubarb?
Well, generally we say about the 1st of July or so is a good time to kind of hold off on harvesting. Same thing with asparagus. Gives the plant some time to kind of build up some carbohydrates again, plus the high temperatures. Sometimes the flavor gets a little bit stronger, and so depends how much of a die-hard rhubarb fanatic you are. If you really got to have some rhubarb, take a few stalks out. It's not going to hurt.
Okay. This one also comes to us from Sioux Falls. Mike, creeping Jenny in the garden. It spreads always in the flower bed and on the south side of the house. They have lilies there. It doesn't want to hurt or lose the lilies. Any ideas on what they can use? They say spray, but whatever method you think they could use.
Wouldn't it be nice if there was just something you could? No, there's not. And so, especially in your flowers. So what you're dealing with is a perennial weed in your perennial flowers, and that's a tough combination. Not a lot you can do there. Sometimes people try to sneak in there with a little glyphosate with maybe a wicking type method. Sometimes you can put a rubber glove on and then a cloth glove over that and soak the fingers a little bit and kind of rub it on some of those areas, or put it on with a little sponge or paper towel, that sort of thing. Being very extremely careful not to touch any of those other flowers that you're trying to keep. This is very risky, high probability you're going to accidentally rub against one of your flowers and then cause severe injury to that plant. So very risky type of deal, but those are the type of things you can do. Otherwise, get in there and just pull it out the best you can and put in some good heavy mulch, maybe 3 to 4 inches thick, something like that, to help suppress that creeping Jenny or that field bindweed. But yeah, you're just going to have to just keep at it, and it's going to probably require some labor to remove that perennial weed from your perennial flowers.
So how would glyphosate work on that?
Yeah, and that's one thing, you don't have to coat the whole plant. Just get parts of it, and then the glyphosate will move in that plant, and then maybe into the roots and that sort of thing. And fall is the best time to do that. And so, that may be a good time to get in there. And that, as long as those leaves are still green on that weed, which will be until end of September, or even into October, probably even end of October, you can get in there and do that. So fall is going to be the best time, but just be extremely careful if you do. Best thing is just go in there by hand, remove as much as you can by hand, and then mulch, that type of thing.
Okay. John Ball, 2 questions here. One's from Winter, one's from Wall. They both deal with ash trees, and they sound quite similar. They've got a gull formation on the ash trees, not nipple gull. They vary in size, pea to nickel size, orange formations on the outside of the gull, sort of powdery. 3 weeks ago they noticed it on the stems and leaves both. The one from Wall says, orange spots on my ash tree leaves, then bumps on the leaves. They're orange, big wart type growth.
Yep. And we even talked about it on the show here earlier. We're seeing a lot of ash rust. More West River than East this year, but they describe the symptoms exactly. You'll find these swollen, orangish, dusty, ugly things on little leaf stalk and on the leaves themselves. And in bad years, you can even find it on the twigs. Generally speaking, it's not fatal, except sometimes to seedlings. Since it's a rust disease, as with many rust diseases, it has an alternate host, which are grasses in this case. We don't generally recommend spraying for it because the spray has to be put down early in the spring, and most years you don't see it. It just this year, again, it was wet, and the ideal conditions for it very similar to what we had in '08, and we are seeing a lot of it this year. But you're going to have an ugly-looking ash tree, even uglier than they normally look, West River, and it'll be fine, or as fine as it can be next year. So not really anything you can do nor need to do at this point.
Okay, thank you, John. Well, on this show, we talk a lot about the questions that come in where we have issues or problems in the garden, in the flower beds. But there are a lot of flower beds and gardens that look very nice out there. And one we wanted to talk about as far as an opportunity here is the Master Gardener Bus Tour, Bus Tour, Wednesday, July 13th, either 9 a.m. or 6 p.m. in Sioux Falls. They're going to view 5 different gardens in that city. And the tickets are available for $10 at the Minnehaha County Extension Office. So Chris DeRosso down there wanted us to mention that opportunity for individuals that would like to participate in that garden tour. So, and I think a number of you have been on that in past years and participated as well. So it's always a great tour for folks. So, going back to our questions, Huron, apple trees. John Kiekefer, this is the 3rd time that they've called in on this, and so we need to give them an answer tonight. Apple scab, or maybe Dave Graper too. They sprayed fruit spray every year in the spring, just after the buds drop off, but they still have some problems. The apples have spots, flat, dark, look like worms, but when they cut open, there's no worms in the apples. Good, just ugly spots on the outside of the apples. So.
Well, I think they're right. I think it is apple scab, and John can chime in on this too. But it sounds like maybe they've only applied the spray once, and it's kind of going to be a repeated process of getting those orchard sprays on there, starting in the spring just as the leaves are forming and continuing on after that. So, John, anything to add?
No, you're right. When they went through it and they said the darkening fruit and blotches, it sounds exactly like apple scab, particularly if they're seeing those olive drab spots on the leaves as well. And you're absolutely right. The first spray takes place just as that bud's expanding. And if you miss that spray, you might as well put the sprayer away for the year, because it's those first 2 sprays that provide the bulk of the control. But it's every 7 to 10 days from then until what they typically say June, or when the weather dries. So this year you'd still be spraying. If it was last year, you'd be spraying all the way up to September, depending on the harvest interval. And typically those kind of general mixes don't always have the best. So I would really recommend they go out and buy a fungicide to treat this rather than the general orchard mix, particularly since the 7 that's often in these, you're spraying them during blossoming, and that's usually not a good idea either. So.
Right, yeah, Larry has talked about that as well. When Larry Osborne has been on in the past, and we've talked a number of times about those mixtures like that, and you're spraying for things that may not be a problem at the time, and like John was saying, you can end up killing off the pollinators that you need to set that apple crop on there. So watch out for those if you're using those combination products.
Yeah. The only thing I would further add, though, is all that ugly-looking fruit, don't just let it fall and rot. Do clean it up, and that's probably our best way to manage it at this time.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. And that's all the time we have for this evening. Just to let you know, Garden Line repeats twice each week on South Dakota Public Broadcasting Digital Channel 3, also known as the Create Channel. The encore broadcast can be seen Fridays at 11 a.m. Central and Saturdays at 4 p.m. Central. Check your local listings to find SDPB Digital Channel 3 where you live. Now time to wrap up. Let's thank our panel of experts, John Kiecafer, Brookings County Extension Educator, David Graper, Extension Horticulturalist, Mike Meckning, Extension Weed Specialist, and John Ball, Extension Forestry Specialist. Thanks to our phone volunteers, the folks from the Brookings area Master Gardeners, and thanks to you for watching and calling in. On behalf of the entire crew, have a good evening and happy gardening.
Funding for Garden Line is provided in part by your membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And by Swiftel Communications.